Mohammed was wounded on the streets near Bethlehem in the West Bank during recent protests here.
Yeah, I think so. Carolyn,
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with a disturbing Al Jazeera report about a terrible injury done to a young Palestinian man outside of Bethlehem. Then another interview with Johanna Rivera. She's working on several projects in Iraq. In one of them, she's the project manager of the People's Development Organization, and that group is trying to stop these so-called honor killings. Then to Yale University, where a group of students had a lunchtime demonstration calling for Yale to stop profiting from businesses that develop fossil fuels. These are companies that are growing rich while they are dumping their carbon waste into the atmosphere. Finally, a video about the surprising facts about wealth and income in the United States. We begin at a hospital in Bethlehem.
The shrapnel sliced through Mohammed's liver. It carried on through his lung and diaphragm before lodging in his spine. Another piece cut into this 13-year-old boy's right leg. My chest hurts, Mohammed says. His petrified parents haven't left their son's bedside. Mohammed was wounded on the streets near Bethlehem in the West Bank during recent protests here.
The kids don't listen to their parents. They're confined. Where can they go? There's no place to go. There's nowhere to play but in the streets.
Since the start of the year, 2 children have been killed and 75 injured during fighting with the Israeli army. And 219 under-18s are in Israeli custody. The protests in recent weeks have been to highlight Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike in Israeli jails.
Israel seems to be not only violating international law, but also violating its own domestic law in terms of using crowd dispersal weapons, and often they're used improperly, meaning at shooting a protester at close range with live ammunition or even rubber bullets, shooting tear gas directly at the protesters when you're not supposed to do that.
The violence peaked last weekend following the death of a 30-year-old man in Israeli custody. Witnesses have told us that Mohammed and a group of boys were standing around here some 30 minutes after the fighting had ended when something was fired from that Israeli guard post over there. Whatever was fired hit the ground, and it was the shrapnel that entered Mohammed's body, nearly killing him. When Mohammed was shot, the Israeli army says it was faced with an extremely violent riot involving 150 Palestinians. It says stones, firebombs and improvised grenades were thrown at their soldiers. The army says that the severity of the threat meant approval was given to fire a small caliber round towards the legs of a rioter who hurled the grenades.
Shrapnel here located and
Mohammed was 30 minutes from death, his surgeon says. Dr. Mahmoud Ibrahim says the wounds were caused by something fired at high velocity. Mohammed is lucky to be alive. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, in the occupied West Bank.
On March 6th, UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, issued a report about the abuse of Palestinian children in Israeli custody. It gave some examples of practices that amount to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention Against Torture. It also said that the pattern of ill treatment includes the practice of blindfolding children and tying their hands with plastic ties, physical and verbal abuse during transfer to an interrogation site, including the use of painful restraints. And that's just the beginning. In activist news, there's a big conference planned for April 6th and 7th on the Palestinian right of return in Boston, Massachusetts. Check our website for details. Now to Johanna Rivera, talking about the practice of honor killing. I'm speaking with Johanna Rivera, who's a project manager at the People's Development Organization in northern Iraq. She was a grad student at UConn, a native of Puerto Rico, and she's been living and working a couple of years now in the northern Kurdish part of Iraq. Good afternoon.
Hi, Stan. How are you?
Now, you're working on the very delicate area of family honor and family honor killings. What is that about?
That's something we're working in the northern part of Iraq, which is when the man of the family or the male members of the family kill a woman because they want to clean their honor or their family name. And that can be for many reasons. For example, if the woman wants to marry a person that she loves as opposed to a person that their father wants to marry her, if she goes at night alone and she doesn't spend the night in the house, if she wants to study and their family doesn't want her to study. We have cases in the West, people who have emigrated to Europe or the US and their family think they're too westernized. They're going out with their friends. They want to do the things like every young woman wants to do in Europe or in the US. So that's seen as staining the family honor.
And I understand even sometimes people have been raped and they blame the woman?
Yes, so if you're a victim of rape, for whatever reason, we have many cases also like that. That's a shame for the family. Of obviously they cannot accept that their women have been raped, so they have to be killed. They have to be removed. It's a shame, so they have to get rid of that. We have one of our cases that we've been advocating for. It's a 15-year-old girl, Nigar. She was killed in July 2012. She was 15 and she was killed by one of her brothers because she was raped. She was pregnant and she gave birth to a child to one of her brothers. Her brother was prosecuted, sent to jail. She was sent to a shelter of the family directorate, or we call it the Directorate of Trace Violence Against Women, was protecting her in a shelter. But they reached an agreement with the government, her family, that they could protect her. They were not going to harm her, so she could safely return to her family. And a month after, she was killed by a second brother, because that was a shame to her family.
And what does this come out of? Is it religion or law or tradition or culture? Where does this idea that you should be doing this to somehow cleanse the family honor?
It's culture. I wouldn't say it comes from religion, because we've been also working with imams to talk to people and to raise awareness to people that this practice is not acceptable under Islam. It's a cultural tradition. It's based on Kurdistan is a very tribal society, patriarchal society.
Patriarchal men rule.
Men are the ones who make decisions, who have control of their whole family. And if they feel their power is under threat, they are going to react and kill and be violent. So I think when they see women taking control or making decisions, that's a threat to their power, and that's not acceptable for them.
How many people are we talking about in a year, let's say, in this area?
Well, the numbers we have come from the Directorate of Violence Against Women, and many women organizations are not. They don't agree with these numbers. Some report hundreds, 150. But
A year.
a year. But we're talking, we see it as violence against women, so we catalog honor killings, but we also talk about forced marriage, we talk about woman burnings, suicide women commit suicide by burning themselves alive. So we're talking about all these cases, and when we started to document these cases in early 2012, it was 18 cases in 2 months. It was 5 killings and 13 cases of suicide or self-burning. So for us, that was alarming. It was not acceptable. So we started to document these cases and to do an advocacy campaign on media, radio, newspapers, talking to the government, meeting government officials. We met the...
Speaking of the government, what's the law about this in northern Iraq?
Well, it used to be condoned if it was for honor to kill a woman, so you got a reduced sentence, but the new law passed in July 2011 says that an honor killing is the same as any other killing. Killing a woman, it's the same crime.
Now, is this new law, it got pushed probably by organizations like your own?
Yes, in 2011, so it's called the domestic violence law. So it condemns honor killings, it condemns forced marriages, it condemns a practice called female genital mutilation, which is female circumcision, and it provides women with legal means to put these cases into court.
Is it being enforced?
No, and this is why we are doing this advocacy campaign. And also many women don't know their rights, and there is also a parallel legal system, which is the tribal system. So we are running on the legal judicial system, but people and tribes and clans are running on the tribal system, which is mostly patriarchal and not taking into consideration the rights of the woman.
I mean, it just seems so bizarre to me, but how do you argue with somebody who thinks that they have to cleanse their family by these killings?
We said that it's not part of our culture. We deny that this is part of our culture, that this is part of religion. We are trying to do advocacy, education, to educate women what are their rights. It's not easy, and it's like rooted in their culture and in their society. That woman is a second-class citizen, that woman cannot work or should not get education, that woman is only to bear children and to stay at home. That's the culture, that there's no respect for women.
And besides the passage of the law, which is not being enforced too well, is there any other good news in this area?
So one of the other cases we've been following is a murder of a teacher, a 28-year-old teacher. Her father killed her because she fell in love with another man who was not her father's favorite. So she married this man and she was murdered. So her case was seen in court, and the man was jailed but later released because of pressures and lack of evidence. So the women organizations were following this case, and in September 11, he was ruled innocent. But because of our advocacy, the Prime Minister of Kurdistan came into the case, and he jailed again. I mean, not he, but he advocated to re-jail this person and to open the case again. So now we're following that case, and that we are talking with the court and telling them about the investigation, that they didn't take into consideration some other aspects, like the police report, the medical report of the killing, that the weapon was returned to the family. So we're trying to...
Wait. The weapon that was used to kill the woman was returned to the people who did the killing.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues, and I think the investigation was not carried out properly. So we wrote a letter to the public prosecutor, and we've been following with the court very closely, women rights organizations. So we're waiting for the case to be reopened and reinvestigated, and we're following up very closely with the media. Is always documented, so everybody in Kurdistan knows about this case, and they know that it was an unjust ruling by the court, that the woman was killed unjustly. So everybody is following up on this, and it's waiting for this case. So I think it's like a blame and shame. So the government will have to deliver on this, and they will have to enforce the law, because the problem is because of the tribal character of the society. It's very difficult. There's a lot of power. These clans have a lot of power. So if a clan is protecting a person who committed a crime, it's very unlikely that the court will do something against that. But because we're putting a lot of pressure, a lot of women organizations and international organizations are backing us up, we are very positive that we're going to have a good outcome on this case, and that will set a precedent for other cases of women killing.
Well, it sounds like you're doing some very good work against pretty serious odds.
Yeah, and I also wanted to share the report that we wrote, so it's on the internet. It's called Not for Honor Killing, in the Name of Tradition or Culture, which documents.
And do you have a website people could go to for more information?
It's www.helic.org.
All right, we can put that right, superimposed, so that's not a problem. Hey, thanks for coming by and talking to us.
Thank you.
I want to note another kind of horrific killing, one we've mentioned in the past, executions in Saudi Arabia. The latest news is that the planned killing of 7 people for the crime of armed robbery has been postponed. There was no one killed in this armed robbery, and some of the people convicted were teenagers at the time of the crime. But the worst part is that the alleged ringleader of this action is slated to be crucified. Yes, you heard that right, crucified. Secretary of State Kerry was in Saudi Arabia, but he made no mention of this outrage while he was there. You should go to our website, thestruggle.org, and join in the campaign against Saudi executions. Now for the environmental action at Yale.
Yeah, I think so. Carolyn, can you read this? I got it.
Yes! Oh! Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Boom. Alice! Yes! Yes! Hi, perfect. Most beautiful job right now. Perfect. Coming in. Yes! Yes!
So I'm here with the group Fossil Free Yale. We're a campus organization encouraging the Yale Investments Office to end its investments in fossil fuels. So right now the university is partially investing its endowment in natural resources, and we suspect that a large amount of that is invested specifically in fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel industry is one of the worst polluters on Earth, and it's one of the main drivers of climate change. So as a concerned citizen, and with my other members of Fossil Free Yale here, we're encouraging Yale to stop investing in an industry, because doing so would be, it's like profiting off of planetary destruction. You know, these companies are really terrible for Earth. And while they have in the past occasionally committed to developing some kind of renewable fuel, they've never stuck to their commitments. So in order to bring about a better energy market with a more diverse array of options, which are renewable or at least carbon friendly, we want to influence the market using Yale's money.
2, 3.
It was a light-hearted action on a very serious subject. We've been talking about the Keystone XL pipeline, and the news is not good. The State Department issued a report giving a green light, saying it wouldn't hurt the environment. And the AFL-CIO issued a statement. There was no opposition at all to the pipeline. The president will make his decision this spring. Now for some surprises about U.S. wealth and income.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.